Vietnam War was not supported by many Americans. When Nixon decided to bomb enemy bases in Cambodia, anti-war rallies were held to show him the disapproval of people in the U.S. A lot of times these rallies were peaceful. Sometimes, though, protesters became drunk and the assembly quickly turned to trashing storefronts and vandalizing property. On May 2nd, the ROTC building was set on fire. This occurred in the days at Kent State preceding May 4th. Police were called, but the 40-man unit at Kent, Ohio could not bring the riots under control. When the university president, Robert White, refused to temporarily close the Kent campus, Governor Rhodes issued orders for 700 men from the National Guard to be sent. The Guard arrived May 3rd, and the students began protesting in their presence. There were reports of students being beaten and threatened with bayonets by the Guard. Tear gas was also used to dispense to the crowd. All of this happened even though Rhodes did not officially sign a martial decree banning assemblies until May 5th, when the decree was declared retroactive to April 30th, 1970.
The long debate over lowering the voting age in America from 21 to 18 began during World War II and intensified during the Vietnam War. When young men were denied the right to vote, were being conscripted to fight for their country. In the 1970 case, Oregon v. Mitchell, a divided U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the right to regulate the minimum age in federal elections, but not at the state and local level. Amid increasing support for a constitutional amendment, Congress passed the 26th Amendment in March 1971. The states promptly ratified it, and President Richard M. Nixon signed it into law that July.
In 1972, the Watergate scandal shook our faith of the presidency. It occurred when President Nixon ordered the break-in at the Watergate complex to bug the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. The guard discovered the break-in when he noticed a taped lock while on his rounds, removed the tape, and returned to find it was retaped. He called the authorities and the break-in was discovered. This led to the resignation of Nixon in 1974.
On March 22, 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by the United States Senate and sent to the states for ratification. First proposed by the National Women's Political Party in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was to provide for the legal equality of the sexes and prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. In March 1972, it was approved by the U.S. Senate and sent to the states. Hawaii was the first state to ratify what would have been the 27th Amendment, followed by some 30 other states within a year. However, during the mid-1970s, a conservative backlash against feminism eroded support for the Equal Rights Amendment, which ultimately failed to achieve ratification by the requisite 38 or 3/4 of the states.
Roe v. Wade was the Supreme Court case that legalized abortion based on the 9th and 14th Amendments. Roe thought that abortion should be legalized when it's her rights despite the state laws. Abortions were thus legally allowed until the baby was considered able to live outside the mother's womb. This decision was made in 1973.
Regnants of the University of California v. Blake was a court case arguing reverse discrimination based on the acceptance process at the University of California. Blake claimed that they were discriminating against him by trying not to discriminate against blacks and other minorities. This resulted in many blacks being accepted over better qualified whites. The court ruled in his favor, resulting in the removal of quota laws that required schools to accept a certain amount of blacks and other minorities, even if they weren't qualified. The Supreme Court decided this in 1978.
The late 1970s mod revival combined musical and cultural elements of the 1970s punk rock, and new wave music genres with influence from the 1960s mod and beat music bands such as The Who, Small Faces, and The Kinks. The revival was largely spurred on by the band The Jam, who had adopted a stark mod look and mixed the energy of punk with the sound of the 1960s mod bands. The Great British Music Festival with The Jam at Wembley in 1978 may have helped to kickstart the mod revival. Another British tradition that returned at the same time was the chant for members of youth subculture to go to seaside resorts on bank holidays and fight members of other subcultures.
Punk rock is a music genre that developed between 1974 and 1976 in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Rooted in garage rock and other forms of what is now known as punk music, punk rock bands, and perceived excess the mainstream 1970s rock. They created fast, hard-edge music, typically with short songs, stripped-down instrumentation, and often political anti-establishment lyrics.
As the 1960s ended, the United States had made two successful and lunar landings. Many Americans lost interest afterward, feeling that since the country had accomplished President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing on the moon by the end of the 1960s, there was no need for further missions. There is also a growing sentiment that the billions of dollars spent on the space program should be put to other uses. The moon landings continued through 1972, but near the loss of the Apollo 13 astronauts in May 1970 served to further anti-NASA feelings. Plans for missions up to Apollo 20 were canceled, and members Apollo and Saturn hardware was used for Skylab space station program 1973-1974 for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, which was carried out in July 1975. Many of the ambitious projects NASA had planned for the 1970s was canceled amid heavy budget cutbacks. Instead, it would devote most of the decade to the development of the space shuttle. ASTP was the last manned American spaceflight for the next 5 years. 1979 witnessed the spectacular re-entry of Skylab over Australia. NASA had planned for a shuttle mission to the space station, but the shuttles were not ready to fly until 1981, too late to save it.
The birth of modern computing was in the 1970s, which saw the development of the world's first general microscope, the C programming language, rudimentary personal computers, pocket calculators, the first supercomputer, customer video games, the earliest floppy disks invented at IBM, which were 8 inches in diameter, became commercially available in 1971. The 1970s were also the start of fiber optics, which transformed the communications industry. Microwave ovens became commercially available. VCRs became commercially available. SALT I is the common name for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreement, also known as Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Negotiations lasted from November 17, 1969 until May 1972 in a series of meetings beginning in Helsinki with the United States delegation headed by Gerald C. Smith, director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Subsequent sessions alternated between Vienna and Helsinki. After a long deadlock, the first results of SALT I came in May 1971 when an agreement was reached over ABM systems. Further discussion brought the negotiations to an end on May 26, 1972 in Moscow when Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed it. This helped to improve relations between the U.S. and the USSR.
On April 6, 1971, the young American ping pong player Glenn Cohen missed his U.S. team bus and was waved by a Chinese table tennis player onto the bus of the Chinese team at the 31st World Table Tennis Championship in Nagoya, Japan. Cohen spoke to the Chinese players in a friendly fashion, and the Chinese player Zhang Zidong, a 3-time world men's signal champion, presented him with a silkscreen portrait of the famous Hongshan Mountains. While this had been a purely spontaneous gesture of friendship between two athletes, the PRC chose to treat it as an official sanctioned outreach. According to the sources from the PRC, the friendly contact between Zhao Zidong and Glenn Cohen, as well as the photograph of the two players at Daejeon-Nakao, had an impact on Mao's decision-making. He had earlier decided not to invite the U.S. team to tour mainland China along with the teams of other Mao countries. But in a move later known as ping pong diplomacy, Mao and the PRC invited the American ping pong team to tour after all. The Americans agreed, and on April 10, 1971, the athletes became the first Americans to officially visit China since the communist takeover in 1949. From February 21st to February 28, 1972, President Nixon traveled to Beijing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai. At the conclusion of his trip, the U.S. and PRC issued the Shanghai Communique, a statement of their respective foreign policy views. In the communique, both nations pledged to work towards the full normalization of diplomatic relations.
The Vietnam ceasefire signed in January of 1973 allowed the United States to pull its troops out of Vietnam peacefully, ending the Vietnam War. 2 years later, in 1975, however, North Vietnam again invaded South Vietnam, but this time successfully resulting in Vietnam being a communist nation, along with nearby Cambodia and Laos.